Ace Frehley played the final note, lifted his head, and waited. But the only thing that came was silence, the kind of silence that can end a career. The studio air hung heavy. 12 people sat or stood in that room. Producers with clipboards. Session musicians with folded arms. Engineers behind the glass. All of them had heard what Ace just played. All of them knew what it meant. None of them applauded. Ace stood in the center of the studio floor, his Gibson Les Paul hanging low in his right hand, cable trailing toward the vintage Marshall stack in the corner. The tube still glowed warm. The reverb was still dying in the acoustic foam. But the room itself had gone cold. He just played the solo they'd asked for. Clean. No effects. No tricks. Just him and the guitar and 32 bars of what he knew was some of the best work of his life. And they sat there. Silent. Judging. Ace didn't speak. He never did in moments like these. He lowered the guitar another inch, waiting. His face showed nothing, no plea for validation, no anger, no confusion. Just that steady, patient expression he'd worn through 1,000 dismissals. The head producer, a man named Gerald Townsend, finally cleared his throat. He was 50-something, gray at the temples, wearing an expensive sweater that looked imported. He'd worked with everyone. Clapton, Beck, Page. And he'd been very clear when Ace walked into this session. "Show me you're more than the makeup and the fire-breathing." Gerald looked at his clipboard. Then at the other producers. Then, finally at Ace. "That was technically proficient," Gerald said, his voice flat, clinical. "But I'm not hearing anything that tells me you understand this project." Technically proficient. The words hung in the air like smoke. One of the session musicians, a bass player whose name Ace hadn't caught, shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. Someone in the control room coughed. The engineer adjusted a fader that didn't need adjusting. Ace didn't defend himself. He never did. He just stood there, guitar in hand, and waited to see if anyone else wanted to speak. Ace didn't defend himself. He never did. To understand what happened in that studio, you need to understand what happened 6 months earlier. Ace Frehley wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. By 1982, he'd already done more than most guitarists dream of. Kiss had sold millions of records. He'd played stadiums. His face, or at least the Silver Spaceman makeup version of it, was on lunchboxes and comic books. But success had created its own kind of prison. People saw the costume before they heard the guitar. They saw the pyrotechnics and the stage show and assumed the music was secondary. Even other musicians, people who should have known better, would smile politely when Ace's name came up in conversation and say things like, "Great showman," in that tone that really meant, "Not a serious player." Ace knew what they thought. He'd known for years. And he'd learned long ago that arguing about it was pointless. You couldn't talk someone into respecting your playing. You could only play, and let them decide for themselves. So when Gerald Townsend's production company called about a session for a major film soundtrack, a prestigious project with serious musicians, the kind of thing that could reshape how people saw you, Ace said yes without hesitation. The call had been clear. No makeup. No stage show. Just you and your instrument. We want to hear what you can actually do. Ace had shown up to the studio on a Tuesday morning in February. The address was in Burbank, a nondescript building with soundproofed walls and vintage gear. He carried his Les Paul in its road-worn case, wore jeans and a leather jacket, his hair long and uncombed. No fanfare. No entourage. Gerald had been waiting in the control room with 3 other producers and a handful of session players who'd been hired to fill out the arrangement. Ace recognized 2 of them, studio veterans who'd played on dozens of hit records. They nodded at him. Professional. Polite. But their eyes said what their mouths didn't. Let's see if you're real or just a costume. We've got a piece that needs a lead, Gerald had explained, playing a backing track through the studio monitors. It was moody, cinematic, strings and piano creating a landscape that needed something sharp and emotional on top. 64 bars. No rules. Show us what you hear. Ace had listened once. Nodded. Strapped on his guitar. You want effects? The engineer asked from behind the glass. No, Ace said quietly. Just the amp. He'd plugged straight into the Marshall. No pedals. No delay. No reverb beyond what the room gave him naturally. Just wood and wire and amplified current. And he'd played. The first take had been exploratory, feeling out the melody, finding where his voice fit into the arrangement. Gerald had stopped him after 40 bars. That's a start. But I need to feel something. Right now it's just notes. Ace had nodded. Adjusted his tuning. Played again. The second take had more emotion. He'd found a melodic hook in the bridge, bent some notes in ways that made the strings cry. One of the session musicians, a keyboard player, had actually looked up from his chart, surprised. But when it ended, Gerald just said, "Better. But I'm still not convinced you're hearing what this piece needs." The third take was the one that mattered. Ace had closed his eyes and stopped thinking about Gerald, stopped thinking about the session players watching him, stopped thinking about proving anything. He just listened to the track and let his fingers find what the music was asking for. It was raw. It was emotional. It was everything he knew how to say without words. The kind of playing that comes from somewhere beyond technique, from the place where guitarists go when they stop performing and start confessing. When he played the final note and let it ring out until it faded into silence, Ace had opened his eyes and looked up. And that's when the silence started. The silence that was still happening now, 30 seconds later, as 12 people sat in judgment of what they'd just heard. Subscribe and leave a comment, because some moments only make sense when we remember them together. Gerald Townsend tapped his pen against his clipboard. Play it again, he said. But this time I want you to think about what the scene actually needs. This is a film score, not a rock concert. We need restraint. We need someone who understands that sometimes less is more. Ace looked at him. Really looked at him. Gerald's face was neutral, professional. But his eyes said everything. I don't believe you can do this. I think you're out of your depth. I think you're a showman pretending to be a musician. One of the producers, a younger man, maybe 30, spoke up from the corner. Gerald, I thought that last take was... We're paying for studio time. Gerald cut him off. Let's use it. Ace, one more time. Show me you understand what we're trying to create here. The session musicians looked at each other. The bass player shook his head slightly, sympathetic but silent. The keyboard player studied his hands. Ace stood there with his guitar, the weight of it familiar in his hands. The Marshall tube still glowed behind him. The cable still connected him to the amplifier. Nothing had changed except the expectation now sitting in the room like a third presence. He could play it again. He could try to give Gerald what Gerald thought he wanted, something safer, more restrained, more professional. He could soften the edges and pull back the emotion and deliver something that would get him a polite "Thank you, we'll be in touch." Or he could do what he'd always done when people underestimated him. He could stop playing their game entirely. Ace unplugged the cable from his guitar. The soft pop of the jack disconnecting echoed in the studio. Everyone looked up, surprised. I'm done, Ace said quietly. Gerald frowned. Excuse me? I played what the music needed, Ace said, his voice calm, factual. If you can't hear it, that's not something I can fix by playing it again. The room went completely still. No one had ever walked out on Gerald Townsend. Not session players trying to make rent. Not established artists trying to expand their resume. Nobody. Ace bent down, carefully coiling his cable. He opened his guitar case, the latches clicking loud in the silence, and laid the Les Paul inside with the kind of care you give something irreplaceable. You're serious, Gerald said, and now there was an edge in his voice. Not anger yet. Something closer to disbelief. Yes, Ace said simply. He closed the case, latched it, picked it up. Away from the spotlight, Ace made a choice no one expected. He walked toward the studio door. Every eye in the room followed him. The session musicians looked shocked. The younger producer was standing now, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Ace's hand was on the door handle when the keyboard player spoke up. "Wait." Ace paused. Didn't turn around. Just waited. The keyboard player stood up from his bench. He was older than Ace had initially thought. Maybe 50, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in studios just like this one. His name was Martin something. Ace had seen him on album credits but never worked with him. "Gerald," Martin said, his voice steady. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've played with people whose names are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And what I just heard was one of the most emotionally honest guitar performances I've ever witnessed in a studio." Gerald's face reddened slightly. "Martin. He played what the scene needed," Martin continued, not backing down. "He played what the music needed. And you're so busy trying to prove he's not good enough that you can't hear it." The room held its breath. Gerald stared at Martin. Then at Ace, still standing by the door. Then back at Martin. "You're out of line," Gerald said quietly. "Maybe," Martin replied. "But I'm also right." The bass player cleared his throat. "For what it's worth," he said slowly, "I thought the last take was perfect." The younger producer nodded. "Me too." Gerald's jaw tightened. He looked down at his clipboard, then up at the control room engineer, who shrugged and said, "I recorded all 3 takes. The last one gave me chills." Ace still hadn't moved from the door. His hand rested on the handle. His guitar case sat at his feet. He wasn't waiting for validation. He was simply giving them the space to decide what happened next. Gerald set down his clipboard slowly. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with his expensive sweater, put them back on. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Play the 3rd take back," he said to the engineer. "Full volume." The engineer nodded, rewound the tape, and pressed play. The studio filled with sound. Ace's guitar, raw and unfiltered, pouring through the monitors. Every bent note. Every moment of silence between phrases. Every choice he'd made in those 64 bars. Gerald closed his eyes and listened. When the final note faded, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he opened his eyes and looked directly at Ace. "I was wrong," Gerald said. The words clearly cost him something. "That's exactly what this film needs. And I apologize for not hearing it the first time." Ace picked up his guitar case and walked back to the center of the studio. He didn't gloat. Didn't say, "I told you so." He simply set the case down, opened it, and plugged his guitar back in. "Should I play it again for the final take?" Ace asked. Gerald shook his head. "No. We already have it. The 3rd take is perfect." What followed silenced everyone in the room. Martin walked over to Ace and extended his hand. "That took courage," he said quietly. Most players would have just given him what he asked for. Ace shook his hand. "I learned a long time ago that if you let people tell you who you are, you stop being yourself." The session wrapped 30 minutes later. The other musicians packed up their gear, several of them stopping to shake Ace's hand or nod respect his way. Gerald stayed in the control room, listening to the take over and over, making notes. As Ace was leaving, the younger producer caught up with him in the hallway. "I wanted to ask you something," the young man said. "When you unplugged and walked toward the door, did you know they'd call you back?" Ace considered the question. "No," he said finally. "But I knew if they didn't I'd be okay. Because I'd played what I knew was right. Everything after that is just other people deciding whether they can hear it." The film came out 8 months later. Ace's guitar work appeared in the climactic scene, a moment of emotional breakthrough that audiences would remember long after they forgot the plot. critics singled out the score as one of the film's strongest elements, and several specifically mentioned the haunting, emotionally raw guitar work that elevated the entire piece. Ace never mentioned the session to anyone, never told the story of walking toward the door, never spoke about Gerald Townsend's initial dismissal or Martin's defense. But Martin did. Years later, in interviews, he would tell the story of the day Ace Frehley walked out on a session because he refused to compromise what he knew was right. And every time he told it, he'd end the same way. Real players don't beg for respect. They just play. And if you can't hear it, that's not their problem. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The Gibson Les Paul Ace used that day stayed in his collection for the rest of his life. He never modified it, never changed anything about it. Because it was the guitar that taught him something he already knew but needed to remember. Silence isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's just people trying to catch up with what you already understand.